In the summer of 1940, the sky above southern England became the proving ground of nations. At 10,000 feet, contrails crossed like chalk marks, and aircraft closed with one another in silence broken only by engine roar. This was the opening phase of the Battle of Britain, where altitude meant advantage and a few seconds could separate survival from fire and sea. British fighters, sleek *** Supermarine Spitfire ***S, met German formations head-on. When the first passes were made, instinct took over. Pilots pushed their noses down, rolling into steep dives to break contact. It was a maneuver drilled into muscle memory, an escape born of training and confidence in their machines. Gravity should have been an ally. Instead, engines coughed. Then they fell silent. Without warning, power vanished. Propellers windmilled uselessly as the aircraft shuddered, no longer predators but falling objects. In those moments, the sky offered no forgiveness. Airspeed bled away. Control stiffened. The dive that should have saved them became a trap measured in heartbeats. Behind them, German fighters followed effortlessly. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 plunged after its prey with full power, its engine untroubled by the same forces of gravity. What had been a pursuit turned into an execution. The advantage was not courage or marksmanship. It was mechanical certainty. Seconds decided everything. Some British pilots managed to coax their engines back to life before the sea rushed up. Others did not. The channel filled with wreckage that told no clear story, only endings. Back at base, the survivors climbed from cockpit shaking, struggling to explain what had happened in the air. Radio reports repeated the same impossible detail. Engines had failed in dives. Not from damage. Not from enemy fire. From something unseen. Ground crews checked fuel lines and spark plugs. Nothing appeared broken. Yet squadrons of the Royal Air Force were losing men to a flaw no one could name, while the Luftwaffe pressed its advantage without understanding it. By late afternoon, one truth settled in. This was not chance, and it was not fear. Something inside Britain's fighters was betraying them, and no one yet knew why. Pilots struggled to explain what their bodies already knew. In after-action reports across southern England, men of the Royal Air Force described the same sensation with different words, a sudden lightness in the controls, followed by silence. Under -G, fuel no longer behaved as fuel was meant to behave. It surged where gravity carried it, away from the engine, starving it at the precise moment power was demanded most. Inside the carburetor, fuel flooded the chamber unevenly. Overwhelming design tolerances never meant for inverted or -G flight. Air-fuel mixtures collapsed. Combustion failed. What pilots experienced as betrayal was, in truth, physics asserting itself without mercy. The engine did not explode. It simply stopped doing its job. Power vanished in mid-maneuver. The aircraft, once responsive, became inert. Control inputs delayed. Altitude evaporated. For roughly 8 seconds, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, the pilot could do nothing but wait. In aerial combat, 8 seconds was not an interval. It was an eternity. German pilots did not share this vulnerability. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, equipped with fuel injection, continued to deliver power regardless of attitude. When British fighters dipped nose down and faltered, German aircraft followed cleanly, engines pulling with unwavering confidence. The sky no longer judged skill evenly. Dogfight shifted in character. What had once been contests of positioning and nerve became asymmetrical encounters governed by invisible limits. A British pilot could fly perfectly and still lose. A German pilot could make the same maneuver and be rewarded for it. Survival was no longer strictly tied to experience or bravery, but to what happened unseen inside the engine cowling. Shock spread quickly through squadrons. Pilots compared notes in mess halls and briefing rooms, realizing the failures were not isolated. The problem was repeatable. Predictable. Worse, it was universal. The realization carried a quiet terror. There was nowhere to hide from it, and no tactic that could fully avoid it. By the time the pattern became undeniable, another question followed close behind. If the cause was mechanical and the danger understood, why had no one foreseen it before men began to die? Some aircraft came back. They limped across the English coast with torn fabric, shattered perspex, and oil streaking along their fuselages. Control surfaces hung unevenly, bullet holes traced the paths of near misses, yet the engines, once restarted, ran well enough to land. Pilots climbed out exhausted but alive, convinced that what had nearly killed them was not enemy fire, but something far more elusive. Others never returned at all. They vanished between altitude and sea, leaving behind only last radio calls and empty dispersal bays. No wreckage spoke clearly. No pattern explained why one man survived a dive while another did not. The losses accumulated unevenly, resisting the logic of attrition that commanders understood. Combat reports deepened the confusion. Engagements that should have favoured British fighters ended abruptly in German victories. Manoeuvres taught in training manuals failed without warning. Squadrons reported being outpaced in situations where speed and position should have been equal. The data did not align with doctrine, and doctrine did not bend easily. At first, blame settled where institutions often place it, on training. Pilots were reminded to maintain positive gear. Briefings emphasized discipline and restraint in dives. The assumption was subtle but firm: technique, not technology, must be at fault. The aircraft were sound. The men must adapt. Yet courage was never questioned. No one doubted the resolve of pilots who flew repeatedly into combat with diminishing odds. Their record spoke for them. Many of the losses were veterans, not novices. Men who had mastered their machines were dying in ways that defied their own experience. On the ground, mechanics searched for answers. Engines were stripped and examined. Fuel lines checked. Carburetors cleaned and reassembled. Nothing appeared broken. Bench tests showed reliable performance. Under controlled conditions, the aircraft behaved exactly as designed. This absence of evidence became its own kind of warning. If nothing was wrong, then something fundamental was being missed. The mystery did not announce itself with smoke or flame. It hid in normality, in systems working precisely as intended, but not as required. As weeks passed, certainty eroded. Losses mounted without explanation, and the sky offered no clues. Somewhere between theory and reality, a gap had opened, and men were falling into it. Britain did not believe its engines could be the problem. By 1940, the nation's faith in its aircraft power plants was absolute, built on years of testing, refinement, and peacetime assurance. At the centre of that confidence stood the Merlin engine, produced by Rolls-Royce, an industrial achievement already regarded as one of the finest aero engines in the world. On test benches, the numbers were unimpeachable. Power curves were smooth. Fuel delivery was stable. Temperatures held within margins. Engineers had pushed the engine through endurance runs that simulated the harshest expected conditions. By every measurable standard, it performed flawlessly. The data did not lie, and Britain trusted data more than rumour. Doctrine followed the same logic. Air combat theory assumed positive G manoeuvres, climbs, turns, and level flight where gravity worked with the engine, not against it. Negative G conditions were considered marginal, rare, almost improper flying. Manuals reflected this assumption. Training reinforced it. The engine had been tested for the war planner's vision of combat, not the chaotic reality unfolding above the channel. What no spreadsheet captured was the way combat forced instinct over theory. Pilots did not consult doctrine when evading gunfire. They reacted. They pushed forward on the stick. They dove. And in doing so, they asked the engine to perform outside the narrow envelope it had been certified to master. Across the channel, German engineering had quietly made a different assumption. Fuel injection systems, more complex and expensive, had been adopted not for elegance, but for reliability under all latitudes. The advantage was not advertised. It did not appear in propaganda. It revealed itself only in the split second when one engine kept pulling and the other did not. British confidence, earned honestly, began to harden into complacency. When machines had never failed in testing, failure in combat was blamed elsewhere. The engine was proven. Therefore, the problem had to be human. This belief was comforting. It preserved institutional pride. It delayed uncomfortable questions. Yet the divergence between expectation and reality grew sharper with every engagement. The sky was exposing a flaw that laboratories had never seen and doctrine had never prepared for. Britain trusted its machines completely, just as those machines were revealing the limits of that trust. Inside offices far from the sound of engines, the problem was reduced to language. Reports were read aloud, summarized, and filed. Committees convened under the authority of the Air Ministry, where men trained to think in procedures searched for explanations that fit established frameworks. Pilot error became the most convenient category. It required no redesign, no admission of oversight, only adjustment. Engineers defended their specifications with confidence earned over years of success. The engines met every requirement asked of them. They performed within tolerances. Bench tests confirmed it repeatedly. From an institutional perspective, the machines were innocent. To question them would mean questioning the assumptions on which Britain's entire air strategy had been built. Negative G flight was discussed, then quietly minimized. It was characterized as an edge case, a deviation from proper technique rather than a condition worth designing around. Official doctrine did not demand engines perform under such stresses, and so the stresses were deemed irrelevant. Reality in the cockpit was filtered through policy written in calmer times. Proposed solutions reflected this distance. Studies were commissioned. Further testing was scheduled. Modifications were considered for future production runs. Each step followed procedure, and each step consumed time. None matched the tempo of the war unfolding daily over Britain's fields and cities. The conflict did not pause for memoranda. While files moved from desk to desk, squadrons flew again the next morning with the same vulnerability. Losses were recorded faster than conclusions. Time, not the enemy, began to feel like one. Every delay carried a cost measured not in hours, but in men. As weeks passed, assumptions hardened. Once written, they gained authority. Once approved, they resisted revision. Arrogance did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, embedded in. Language that framed urgency as impatience and skepticism as disloyalty. The system protected itself by insisting it could not be wrong. Yet outside those rooms, pilots continued to report the same failure under the same conditions. The evidence was repetitive, insistent, and increasingly difficult to ignore. The question was no longer whether something was wrong, but whether the institution could admit it in time. Somewhere beyond the committees and schedules, an answer existed that required neither redesign nor delay. It waited for someone willing to look past assumption and listen more closely to the machine. Before the war turned the sky into a battlefield, Beatrice Shilling had built her reputation far from combat. She worked with racing engines, machines pushed to their limits not by doctrine but by speed. On tracks where fractions of a second mattered, engines were asked to perform under violent changes in force and attitude. Failure there was immediate and instructive. You learned quickly, or you did not finish. Shilling understood fuel not as an abstraction on paper, but as a living behavior governed by gravity, pressure, and flow. She had watched it surge, starve, flood, and recover in conditions that engineers rarely modeled fully. Racing taught her that engines did not fail randomly. They failed honestly when design met reality without compromise. Her perspective bridged two worlds. The sky demanded the same truth that the track had taught her, that machines do not care about intent, only conditions. When pilots spoke of engines cutting during dives, she did not hear fear or error. She heard a system responding exactly as it was built to respond, just not as it was being asked to. Unlike committees, Shilling listened closely to pilots. She asked when the failure occurred, how abruptly, and under what control inputs. She paid attention to the moments just before power vanished. Patterns emerged quickly. Negative G sudden nose-down movement. fuel behaving badly where gravity no longer cooperated. She distrusted assumptions that arrived fully formed. The idea that trained pilots were suddenly making identical mistakes did not satisfy her. Courage was not variable enough. Training was not suddenly deficient. The consistency of the failure suggested something mechanical, repeatable, and therefore solvable. To Schilling, the problem did not feel human at all. It felt like physics. A design optimized for one environment being forced into another. The engine was doing exactly what it had been allowed to do, and nothing more. The flaw was not dramatic. It was mundane. That made it dangerous. As she traced the logic backward from cockpit to carburetor, a quiet realization took shape. The answer would not come from new doctrine or better discipline. It would come from accepting that a trusted machine had been trusted too completely. And once that belief fractured, the path forward, however inelegant, began to appear. She began with the diagrams. Not the heroic outlines of aircraft, but the dense, uncelebrated drawings that mapped how fuel moved through brass passages and narrow throats. Carburetors were familiar territory, devices of balance and compromise, designed to behave predictably when gravity was stable and assumptions held. On paper, the system looked elegant. In the air, it was betraying men. By recreating the conditions pilots described, the problem emerged quickly. Under negative G, fuel no longer flowed downward into the engine. It surged upward, flooding chambers meant to meter it with restraint. What had been a precise mixture became chaos. Air was displaced. Combustion faltered. The engine did not fail catastrophically, it simply drowned. There was no mystery in the physics. Gravity, once an ally, had turned adversary. The carburetor had never been designed to defy it. In level flight, everything worked. In climbs, it worked better. But when the aircraft tipped forward abruptly, fuel obeyed gravity, not intent. Precision engineering was undone by a force too fundamental to negotiate with. The flaw was almost offensively simple. No cracked casing. No faulty workmanship. Just fuel behaving exactly as fuel always had. The danger lay in how invisible the failure was until it mattered most. In combat, pilots crossed that threshold without warning, and the engine crossed it with them. A full redesign was the obvious answer, and entirely impossible. Replacing carburetors across the fleet would take months Britain did not have. Fuel injection systems were complex, scarce, and bound to future production lines. The war demanded solutions measured in days, not quarters. Perfection was irrelevant. Survival was not. What was needed was restraint. Not elegance, not innovation in the grand sense, but control. If fuel could be prevented from surging freely under negative G, the engine might stumble, but it would not die. The dive would still be dangerous, but no longer fatal by design. This realization marked a shift in thinking. The goal was no longer to fix the engine completely, but to reduce the failure window. To shorten the moment of helplessness. To buy pilot seconds enough to live. It was a philosophy born of urgency, not pride. The answer would not look impressive. It would not satisfy theorists or purists. It would offend those who believed engineering should be beautiful. But it could be made quickly, installed easily, and reversed later without regret. In that narrow space between flaw and catastrophe, a temporary idea took shape, small, blunt, and unassuming. And in war, that was often enough. The solution did not arrive with blueprint spanning walls or new materials shipped under guard. It arrived as a restraint, a decision to limit rather than expand. Schilling designed a restrictor plate, nothing more than a thin metal disc, cut precisely with a single calibrated hole at its center. Its purpose was not to perfect fuel flow, but to slow it down when gravity turned hostile. Installed at the carburetor's intake, the washer acted as a governor under sudden negative G. When fuel surged upward, the opening prevented the full volume from flooding the chamber at once. The mixture still faltered, but it did not collapse entirely. Combustion stumbled, then recovered. The engine coughed, but it kept turning. The change transformed the most dangerous moment of the dive. What had once been 8 seconds of helplessness shrank to 1 or 2. Enough time to retain control. Enough to survive. The aircraft no longer became a falling object. It remained a machine with options. There was nothing elegant about it. Engineers accustomed to refinement bristled at the idea. The washer reduced maximum power slightly. It compromised ideal performance in exchange for reliability under stress. In peacetime, it would have been rejected outright. In war, it was exactly what the moment required. Its greatest virtue was speed. The washer could be produced quickly from existing materials and installed without redesigning the engine or grounding squadrons for weeks. Ground crews could fit it during routine maintenance. No new training manuals were required. No doctrine needed rewriting. The solution respected the one resource Britain could not spare: time. Trials confirmed what theory predicted. Engines still hesitated under -G, but they recovered fast enough to matter. Pilots reported the difference immediately. The fear did not vanish, but it became manageable. The dive was no longer a gamble with fate. It was a risk with boundaries. Critics noted what the washer did not do. It did not eliminate the flaw. It did not match the smooth certainty of fuel injection. It was, by any aesthetic measure, a crude fix. But war did not reward beauty. It rewarded function delivered in time. With approval granted, production began quietly. No announcement followed. No commendation accompanied it. The washer spread through the fleet not as a triumph, but as a necessity. A small part slipped into engines across Britain unnoticed by those who would soon depend on it. The struggle that had consumed committees and cost lives shifted into action almost overnight. A problem once debated in theory was now addressed in metal. And as pilots returned to the sky with this modest alteration beneath their cowls, the air war prepared to change, without spectacle, without fanfare, and without waiting for perfection. The first pilots to fly with the modification were not briefed with promises. They were told only what to expect. The engine might still hesitate in a -G dive, but it would come back. The washer did not rewrite physics. It narrowed the window in which physics could kill. For men accustomed to gambling with seconds, that distinction mattered. In the air, the difference announced itself quietly. Pilots pushed forward on the stick and felt the familiar stumble, but this time it passed. The engine coughed, then caught. Control returned before panic could take hold. What had once been an uncontrolled fall became a survivable maneuver. The aircraft no longer punished instinct. It tolerated it. Reports followed within days. The dive was no longer forbidden territory. Pilots learned to work within the imperfection, timing their maneuvers with a new awareness of the machine's limits. The washer did not make them invincible. It made them alive. And in combat, that was enough. Across engagements, something subtle began to change. German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109 had grown accustomed to certainty. When British fighters dove, they expected the kill to follow. Now, increasingly, it did not. The Spitfire recovered. The pursuit no longer ended in a guaranteed advantage. Confidence, once mechanical, began to erode. Tactically, the sky grew more balanced. British pilots re-entered vertical maneuvers they had avoided for weeks. Engagement envelopes widened. Dogfights became contests again, not calculations dictated by an unseen flaw. The washer did not give the Royal Air Force superiority. It restored parity. What saved lives was not brilliance, but humility. The willingness to accept a solution that admitted imperfection. Engineers had resisted elegance in favor of immediacy. Pilots accepted reduced peak performance in exchange for reliability. Each compromise acknowledged a truth war enforced relentlessly: machines do not need to be perfect. They need to work when it matters. Losses did not stop overnight. War offered no such mercy. But patterns shifted. Survivability increased. Experienced pilots flew again the next day. Squadrons retained skill instead of replacing it. The washer's impact was not measured in victories claimed, but in absences from casualty lists. Momentum changed without ceremony. No signal marked the moment when the balance tipped, because it did not tip, it eased. Confidence returned first, statistics later. Pilots felt it before commanders could chart it. The air war began to stabilize not through firepower, but through restraint applied at exactly the right point. What followed would not look like triumph. It would look like fewer funerals, steadier squadrons, and time for Britain to endure. And only later would anyone begin to ask how much difference a single, imperfect piece of metal had truly made. The change did not announce itself with headlines. There was no single day when commanders declared the crisis over. Instead, numbers began to shift almost imperceptibly. Losses within the Royal Air Force slowed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those who lived inside the figures. Aircraft that might once have been lost were now returning, damaged but intact. Pilots who would have vanished were landing, shaken and flying again. Confidence returned first, long before statistics could confirm it. Pilots re-entered dives without the paralyzing hesitation that had crept into earlier engagements. They no longer treated the nose-down maneuver as a last resort. It became a tool again, dangerous, but usable. The aircraft had not become perfect. It had become predictable, and predictability was power. As confidence grew, tactics followed. Engagement envelopes widened. British pilots were willing to fight vertically again, not just horizontally. The sky opened back up into 3 dimensions. Dogfights regained complexity, and with it, opportunity. What had once been a narrow corridor of safe maneuvers expanded into something resembling freedom. For German pilots, the change was unsettling. The mechanical certainty they had relied upon began to erode. The familiar pattern, British fighters diving and faltering, no longer held. The Luftwaffe still possessed advantages, but they were no longer guaranteed. Combat demanded renewed caution. Confidence, once automatic, became conditional. Morale responded faster than any report could capture. Squadrons sensed the shift before commanders quantified it. Pilots spoke less of unavoidable losses and more of choices made in combat. Survival felt less arbitrary. The psychological weight that had pressed on men daily began, slowly, to lift. The washer spread quietly through the fleet. It required no ceremony. Ground crews installed it as a matter of routine, aircraft by aircraft, squadron by squadron. There was no special designation, no painted marking to announce its presence. Its success lay in its invisibility. When it worked, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. The turning point, when it came, did not resemble victory. It looked like stability, like fewer empty chairs in briefing rooms, like experience retained rather than replaced. Britain did not win the air war in a single stroke. It endured it. An endurance, sustained long enough, would change everything. The true measure of the washer did not reveal itself during the battle. It emerged later, in quieter rooms, when historians and analysts sifted through records no longer clouded by urgency. Post-war analysis compared engagement data before and after the modification spread through frontline squadrons. Patterns that had once felt anecdotal hardened into evidence. Survivability in negative G encounters increased measurably. Not absolutely, and not dramatically, but consistently. The most dangerous phase of the dive no longer ended so often in loss. Pilots who would previously have been killed or forced into the sea were now landing, debriefing, and flying again. Over time, those survivals accumulated. The number that emerged, an estimated 2,100 pilots, was not a tally of victories. It was a count of men who lived. It represented aircraft that returned instead of vanishing, voices that answered roll call instead of being marked absent. These were not dramatic rescues or celebrated dogfights. They were negative spaces in casualty lists, the quiet arithmetic of lives not taken. Each survival carried weight beyond the individual. A pilot who lived gained experience. A squadron that retained veterans grew sharper, more coordinated, more lethal over time. Skill compounded. Judgment improved. The air war rewarded continuity, and continuity depended on survival measured in seconds gained during a dive. These were effects no enemy intelligence officer could easily detect. There was no captured document announcing the change. No intercepted signal explaining why British fighters were harder to finish. The impact spread invisibly, embedded in the growing competence of squadrons that did not need to relearn hard lessons each month. Only when numbers were finally laid side by side did the scale become clear. The washer had not altered tactics alone. It had altered time. It bought Britain weeks, then months, during which experienced pilots remained in the fight. In a battle of endurance, that margin mattered more than any single engagement. War histories often search for decisive moments, battles won, aces counted, machines perfected. But here, the decision revealed itself statistically, not theatrically. It appeared in survival curves bending upward, just enough to change outcomes down the line. When the numbers finally spoke, they did not speak of heroism. They spoke of restraint, timing, and a problem solved before it could claim thousands more. In time, the perfect solution arrived. Fuel injection, precise, reliable, indifferent to gravity, replaced carburetors in newer designs and later variants. The flaw that had haunted Britain's fighters in 1940 was engineered out entirely, not with restraint but with sophistication. Engines no longer cared which way the aircraft pointed. Power followed intention without hesitation. But by then, the crisis had passed. The war had already demanded its answer, and it had not waited for elegance. Fuel injection required retooling, retraining, and industrial capacity stretched thin by urgency elsewhere. It was the right solution, just not the right one for that moment in history. In 1940, Britain did not need perfection. It needed something that worked immediately. Wartime necessity rewrote engineering priorities. Beauty gave way to speed. Temporary fixes were no longer embarrassing compromises, they were instruments of survival. The washer, crude and unapologetic, had done what the ideal system could not. It arrived in time. It fit the constraints of war rather than defying them. There was no celebration when fuel injection finally became standard. No ceremony marked the transition. Progress in war rarely pauses to acknowledge what it replaces. The washer simply faded into obsolescence, having served its purpose quietly and completely. Its success lay in making itself unnecessary. This was the true climax of the story, though it passed almost unnoticed. Not a battle won, but a lesson learned. That the value of an idea is measured not by its refinement, but by its relevance to the moment it enters the world. That timing, not brilliance, often decides outcomes. War rewards pragmatism with survival. It is indifferent to intention and merciless toward delay. Solutions are judged not by how they appear on drawing boards, but by whether they reach the front before the problem claims more lives. What began as an improvised restraint became a decisive intervention. Not because it was right forever, but because it was right then. And in war, then is everything. Britain survived the air campaign. The skies did not fall silent, but the immediate threat passed, and with it the sense of imminent collapse. The Battle of Britain slipped into history as attention shifted eastward and southward toward new fronts and larger movements of armies. What had been an existential struggle became, almost overnight, a chapter. With survival secured, memory began to simplify. Official narratives took shape around aircraft, squadrons, and names that fit easily into headlines. The Spitfire became an icon. Aces became symbols. Victory, such as it was, acquired faces and silhouettes suitable for posters and speeches. In this quieter phase, Beatrice Schilling returned to her work. There was no victory tour, no public recognition equal to the lives her solution had preserved. She moved on to new problems, new machines, applying the same discipline she always had. Engineering, for her, was not about legacy. It was about function. Her contribution faded quickly from public view. It did not lend itself to mythology. A washer could not be flown in formation. It could not be painted on a fuselage or credited with kills. It existed only inside engines, anonymous and replaceable, doing its work without spectacle. Official histories favored what could be seen and named. They recorded aircraft types, sortie numbers, and individual heroism. Small parts vanished from the narrative, along with the quiet decisions that had shaped outcomes behind the scenes. The washer was not forgotten deliberately. It was simply too modest to compete with louder stories. Yet its absence from memory did not diminish its consequence. Thousands of pilots carried forward their lives because of it into later battles, into post-war years, into families, and futures never listed in operational summaries. The air campaign survival had depended not only on courage, but on correction. This was the lingering truth the history books rarely paused to examine. That wars are often decided by adjustments so small they resist celebration. That endurance sometimes rests on unglamorous restraint rather than bold innovation. In the quiet after the battle, when attention moved on and history began to condense, the washer disappeared from view. But its effects did not. They lived on, unspoken, in the simple fact that Britain was still there to remember anything at all. War mythology prefers grand designs. It remembers the aircraft that looked fast even standing still, the weapons that arrived complete, powerful, and unmistakable. These stories are clean. They suggest that victory flows from brilliance revealed in a single moment, as if history were waiting for genius to announce itself. Reality is rarely so accommodating. What decides wars more often are corrections, small, uncelebrated adjustments made after failure has already occurred. Engineering in combat is not heroic. It is iterative. It advances not through inspiration alone, but through attention to what breaks, when it breaks, and why. Progress comes from admitting that something trusted has failed under conditions no one wished to imagine. In this case, innovation did not mean inventing a new engine. It meant listening. Pilots reported a problem repeatedly and consistently. Their experience contained the data. The solution emerged only when someone took those accounts seriously, without filtering them through doctrine or pride. Listening became not a courtesy, but a strategic asset. Ego, by contrast, proved expensive. Confidence in specifications delayed action. Faith in past success resisted revision. Institutions protected their assumptions long after evidence demanded change. None of this was malicious. It was human. But in war, delay carries consequences measured in lives. Humility accelerated everything. The moment the problem was accepted as mechanical rather than personal, solutions multiplied. Once perfection was abandoned as a requirement, effectiveness became achievable. The washer succeeded not because it was clever, but because it was honest about limitations and fast enough to matter. This is what innovation often looks like under pressure. Not elegance, but relevance. Not completeness, but sufficiency. A willingness to accept that the first answer may be wrong, and the second one incomplete, but still necessary. The moral crystallizes here, away from the noise of battle. That progress depends less on brilliance than on responsiveness. That the most valuable ideas are sometimes the least impressive to look at. And that survival often hinges on those willing to revise belief before the cost becomes unbearable. In the end, the lesson was not about engines or aircraft. It was about restraint applied at the right moment by someone prepared to admit that the machine, like the system around it, could be improved. That kind of innovation rarely receives applause. But it endures. The washer never flew. It never felt the cold at altitude or the violence of flak tearing past aluminum skin. It never fired a shot, never claimed a victory, never appeared in a communique or a speech. No pilot painted it on a fuselage. No newspaper printed its photograph. And yet, day after day, it altered outcomes in the air over Britain. Its work was done in silence, inside engines that no longer betrayed their pilots at the worst possible moment. Each time a Spitfire dove and recovered instead of falling mute, the washer had done its job. Each time a pilot lived to climb out of a cockpit instead of being written into a report, its effect repeated itself. Not once, but thousands of times. It saved pilots who went on to save others. Men who survived one engagement gained experience, and experience compounded into advantage. Squadrons hardened instead of hollowed out. Skill stayed where it belonged, at the front. What looked like parity in the air was built on accumulation, on lives preserved long enough to matter. In this way, inferiority was turned into balance, and balance into endurance. Britain did not need superiority in 1940. It needed time. The washer bought that time in increments measured in seconds, then days, then months. The air war was not rewritten by a single dogfight, but by thousands of survivable dives. This is how the sky was changed without spectacle. The washer did not defeat the enemy directly. It corrected an assumption. That assumption had been reasonable, even justified, that proven machines would behave as expected, that doctrine reflected reality, that what worked in testing would hold in combat. War exposed the cost of that belief. The correction came not from authority, but from attention. From an engineer willing to accept that the machine was honest, but incomplete. Beatrice Schilling did not challenge courage or competence. She challenged certainty. And in doing so, she shifted the balance of a campaign without ever stepping into a cockpit. History often remembers what is loud. What shines? What can be counted easily? It struggles with what is quiet, incremental, and hidden from view. Yet wars are won as much by restraint as by force, by correction as much as by creation. The washer never became famous. It never needed to. Its legacy lives in absence, in the pilots who were not lost, the squadrons that did not collapse, the nation that endured long enough to fight another day. They trusted the machine. One woman fixed the assumption.